At 19 years old, Jordan Brown stepped into the Los Angeles County Courthouse, looking more like a college freshman than a defendant facing serious charges. Yet the accusation against him, grand theft auto and resisting arrest, had drawn a crowd of onlookers who assumed they already knew the ending. Presiding over the case was Judge Leonard Collins, a man whose slight frown and impatient drumming of fingers indicated he expected a quick admission of guilt from this seemingly clueless teenager. In the gallery, folks shifted and whispered, guessing that Jordan must have made a terrible mistake. A 2022 Audi A6 was reported stolen. The police gave chase, and a young man in a hoodie was caught near the scene. It all seemed open and shut. However, even from his seat at the defendant's table, Jordan showed a calm confidence that suggested there was more to the story. Across the aisle, prosecutor Anthony Pierce wore a pinstripe suit and a self-assured smirk, already relishing what he believed would be a straightforward conviction. He rattled off details: the stolen vehicle, the alleged fingerprints found on the steering wheel, and the testimony from Officer Derek Lopez about seeing Jordan flee. While many in the courtroom believed this would end in a matter of minutes, Jordan quietly observed each claim, steadily noting inconsistencies that only he seemed to notice. Judge Collins, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, casually flipping pages of the case file, occasionally casting a skeptical eye at Jordan. It was clear he viewed this as yet another routine matter, a young defendant who would likely bungle his defense before lunch. However, as the formalities began, Jordan raised a hand, politely interrupting his anxious public defender. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I'd like to represent myself." The hush that fell over the room was almost tangible. People stopped shifting in their seats. Even Anthony Pierce paused mid-sentence, as though he could not believe what he had just heard. Judge Collins lifted an eyebrow, almost amused at the nerve of this teenager, but he granted the request. The entire tone of the hearing shifted. No longer was Jordan merely a defendant who seemed in over his head. His quiet confidence morphed into sharp insight as he began asking pointed questions about the chain of custody for the fingerprint evidence and the reliability of the officer's official report. Onlookers leaned forward, astonished that this 19-year-old was able to spot holes in what looked like solid proof. Judge Collins tapped his gavel lightly, trying to maintain order, but there was a growing awareness in the room that Jordan Brown was not the defenseless teen everyone had assumed. What initially promised to be a swift and predictable case was, in fact, just beginning to unravel. Jordan Brown's decision to represent himself in the Los Angeles County Courthouse seemed bold enough, but what truly surprised everyone was the depth of his legal knowledge, far beyond what a typical 19-year-old might possess. Growing up, Jordan spent countless hours poring over transcripts, watching recorded trials, and analyzing how each side built their arguments. He had soaked up stories from his mother, Alicia Brown, who worked for over 2 decades as a paralegal. She often came home venting about attorneys who cut corners, judges who showed open bias, and how even public defenders sometimes did just enough to move a case along. Those details, absorbed casually over family dinners or during Alicia's late-night research sessions, shaped Jordan's understanding of court proceedings more than anyone realized. Now, standing in front of Judge Leonard Collins, Jordan revealed that understanding step by step. As soon as the prosecutor, Anthony Pierce, launched into his opening statements, confidently listing off alleged evidence about the stolen 2022 Audi A6, Jordan followed along without flinching. Instead of spacing out or appearing overwhelmed, he maintained steady eye contact and made quick notes whenever Pierce mentioned anything that seemed vague or incomplete. When the chance came for Jordan to speak, he did so in a measured tone, explaining that he needed to clarify a few inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline. This simple request, normally routine, took on a new weight because it came from the defendant himself. Murmurs rose in the gallery, and Judge Collins leaned forward, clearly caught off guard. One by one, Jordan asked about the precise time stamp of Officer Derek Lopez's police report, the exact location of the alleged pursuit, and how the officer claimed to have seen him in the driver's seat. Each question hinted that Jordan believed gaps existed in the official account, and those questions were not random. They mirrored what Alicia Brown had always taught him. Never assume every fact is accurate, and always look for places where paperwork doesn't match reality. Even Judge Collins, initially skeptical, appeared intrigued by how calmly Jordan guided the conversation. Pierce attempted to redirect, emphasizing the seriousness of the charges, yet Jordan pressed on. He noted that if Officer Lopez's recollection were as certain as claimed, there should be indisputable proof, like a dashcam video or properly documented timestamps. This line of questioning showed that Jordan understood not only his right to challenge the evidence, but also the correct procedures for doing so. Soon, Jordan's unexpected mastery of the courtroom began to unsettle Pierce, whose once confident tone started faltering. Observers exchanged surprised glances, witnessing how a young defendant they had judged too quickly was deftly poking holes in the prosecution's story. By the time Jordan finished his preliminary points, an unmistakable hush spread across the courtroom, leaving everyone, from the reporters scribbling notes to the bailiff standing guard, wondering how much further this quiet young man's expertise would take him. From the moment Jordan Brown assumed the role of his own attorney, prosecutor Anthony Pierce maintained that the evidence against him was overwhelming. Yet small cracks soon started to appear. The central claim of the case revolved around a 2022 Audi A6, allegedly stolen, and discovered by police shortly after midnight. According to Pierce, Jordan's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, providing what seemed at first glance like irrefutable proof of his guilt. However, Jordan didn't shy away from questioning the reliability of this fingerprint evidence. In a calm, measured tone, he asked why no forensic specialist had been called to testify about proper chain of custody procedures or how thoroughly the prints were analyzed. The silent looks exchanged among the prosecution team suggested they had not anticipated such detailed scrutiny. Another key piece of the prosecution's argument was the sworn statement by Officer Derek Lopez, who claimed to have personally witnessed Jordan behind the wheel before the Audi sped off. Standing at the lectern in the Los Angeles County Courthouse, Jordan politely inquired about the officer's official schedule that evening. To everyone's surprise, it turned out Officer Lopez's shift had ended nearly an hour before the alleged sighting. When Jordan asked whether the court could verify the officer's patrol car GPS logs for that time, Pierce attempted to deflect. Yet that hesitation only sharpened the jury's attention. If the prosecution was so confident, why resist confirming the timeline? Bit by bit, Jordan continued highlighting the gaps in the state's case. He introduced a statement from Richard Campbell, the owner of the Audi, who had reported that a different individual, someone noticeably not matching Jordan's description, jumped into his car when he left it idling at a gas station. No one in the room missed the significance of these details. If Campbell himself pointed to a different suspect, why had authorities zeroed in on Jordan? Explaining his side of the story, Jordan acknowledged he had briefly touched the vehicle earlier that evening, but only out of curiosity since it was left unlocked. He'd been walking home from a convenience store with friends, completely unaware of the trouble brewing around that abandoned Audi. As Jordan delivered these points, the tension in the courtroom became palpable. Judge Leonard Collins, who had initially seemed dismissive, now looked intently at each piece of new evidence. The gallery, filled with reporters and curious onlookers, watched as Anthony Pierce fumbled through his notes, trying to salvage the strength of his argument. Yet each time Pierce tried to regain the upper hand, Jordan calmly offered another question that exposed another oversight. In the span of less than an hour, what once appeared like an airtight case had begun to unravel under the weight of prosecution's own weak evidence, a fact that neither the judge nor anyone else in that room could deny. Jordan Brown's quiet determination continued to reshape the atmosphere in the Los Angeles County Courthouse, exposing disturbing cracks in what many had assumed to be a simple, straightforward case of grand theft auto. Although prosecutor Anthony Pierce tried to steer the focus back to a single narrative, a supposedly foolproof arrest and unequivocal evidence against Jordan, each new revelation seemed to paint a different picture. In calmly tracing Officer Derek Lopez's exact timeline and introducing the car owner's contradictory statement, Jordan offered a compelling alternative. Perhaps he wasn't the actual suspect at all, and perhaps law enforcement leaped to conclusions based on little more than his presence in the wrong place at the wrong time. The more Jordan spoke, the more onlookers in the gallery noticed the unspoken tension beneath the surface. A few even exchanged pointed glances, especially when Jordan asked why the police had apparently failed to consider the car owner's initial description, which highlighted that the real culprit was someone who didn't resemble Jordan in the slightest. Judge Leonard Collins, whose demeanor had started off bordering on dismissive, now leaned in, intently listening as Jordan outlined how a flawed assumption can snowball into a wrongful arrest. With each passing minute, that assumption looked increasingly like a product of haste, or possibly something deeper and more systemic. Standing at the defendant's table, Jordan did not raise his voice or resort to dramatics. Instead, he appealed to the court's sense of justice by pointing out that he had done nothing to warrant immediate suspicion. "Is it because I happen to be a young, African-American man near that neighborhood?" he asked quietly, glancing from a jury toward the judge. The few words carried enormous weight, and a hush fell over the room. Even the occasional cough or squeak of a chair disappeared as people considered the implications. In this moment, the repeated mention of incomplete records, questionable testimony, and disregarded evidence suddenly felt less like a minor oversight and more like a telling pattern. For his part, Pierce scrambled to maintain his composure, realizing that if the court perceived blatant bias at work, the entire prosecution might collapse. When Jordan described Officer Lopez's actions, particularly how the officer seemed to zero in on him moments after arriving on the scene, several jurors exchanged concerned expressions. It was no longer enough for Pierce to claim that Jordan's prints on the steering wheel ended the conversation. The notion that such prints could have come from an innocent moment of contact, coupled with the suspicious gaps in the timeline, made the state's case appear hastily assembled. Judge Collins, tapping his pen on the bench, quietly observed this shift. He recognized how easily prejudice, shortcuts, and unverified assumptions might blend together to create a serious miscarriage of justice. In that single courtroom, the weight of Jordan's words began to reveal a larger, unsettling truth. The line between proper policing and unfair profiling can be perilously thin, especially when no one stops to ask the right questions. Jordan Brown stood in the Los Angeles County Courthouse, heart pounding as the final moments of the trial unfolded around him. Despite his calm demeanor, it was clear that the prosecution's once unshakable case against him had fallen apart beneath the weight of unanswered questions and contradictory evidence. Judge Leonard Collins, who had begun the day with a skeptical gaze fixed on Jordan, now found himself re-examining the state's key points. Officer Derek Lopez's testimony had been proven unreliable. The official timeline of events did not add up, and Richard Campbell, the Audi's owner, had provided a statement that flatly contradicted everything prosecutor Anthony Pierce had claimed. With every question Jordan raised about chain of custody or missing reports, onlookers realized that the real story was far different from a neat narrative the prosecution once presented. As the gallery buzzed, Judge Collins called for order, rapping his gavel lightly. He took a moment to leaf through several pages of notes, then removed his glasses and fixed a steady look on Pierce. "Counselor," he said, voice resonating through the silent courtroom, "it appears that the state has failed to meet its burden of proof." The tension rose even higher, if that was possible. People leaned forward, expecting further debate, but Pierce could only nod, lips pressed tightly together in defeat. The evidence, or lack thereof, had spoken for itself. Jordan stood motionless, a faint note of relief flickering in his expression as he met the judge's gaze. An audible hush swept the room when Judge Collins finally addressed Jordan directly. "Mr. Brown," he began, measuring each word. "Based on the facts presented, and more tellingly, not presented, I'm left with no choice but to dismiss all charges." In that instant, the gallery erupted in a flurry of gasps, exclamations, and frantic note-taking from reporters. Jordan exhaled, his eyes momentarily closed, absorbing the significance of what had just happened. It took only seconds for the crowd to start shifting again, some people turning to their neighbors, others rushing for the exit to spread the news. Yet Jordan remained still, collecting himself, until he finally stepped away from the defendant's table. Before he could exit the courtroom, Judge Collins cleared his throat, halting commotion just long enough to add, "Mr. Brown, if you ever want to pursue a career in law, I dare say you have the makings of a fine attorney." A flicker of surprise danced across Jordan's face, followed by a small, respectful nod. Outside, reporters thrust microphones into his path, cameras flashing as bystanders craned their necks for a closer look. In the midst of it all stood Alicia Brown, arms folded, meeting her son's gaze with an unspoken sense of pride. She stepped forward, enveloping him in a brief hug, whispering that she had never doubted him for a second. In that simple embrace, Jordan realized that while this battle was over, his calling to fix the system had only just begun. As the final echoes of the dismissed case drifted to the corridors of the Los Angeles County Courthouse, Jordan Brown stepped outside to find himself momentarily dazzled by the California sun. Reporters had mostly dispersed after peppering him with questions, leaving behind a quieter scene. Yet despite the hush that settled, Jordan's mind kept returning to the stark reality his ordeal had revealed. He realized that for every person like him, willing and able to fight back, there might be countless others who lacked the experience or confidence to do so. Inside the courtroom, Judge Leonard Collins had seen enough evidence to overturn the accusations brought by prosecutor Anthony Pierce, acknowledging that Jordan's arrest and indictment were more the product of flawed assumptions than solid proof. In those decisive moments, though, Jordan had glimpsed a troubling truth. If he hadn't recognized the holes in Officer Derek Lopez's testimony, or if he hadn't discovered that Richard Campbell's original statement contradicted the prosecution's entire case, he could have been just another statistic of wrongful conviction. Standing near the courthouse steps, he felt a rush of gratitude for the support he'd received, but also a surge of responsibility. It wasn't just about clearing his name. This case exposed how easily an innocent individual might be railroaded, especially when the system leans on unchecked biases, shallow investigations, or mere convenience. That thought weighed on him, knowing that many people facing similar circumstances lack even the basic tools to defend themselves. Perhaps they trust their court-appointed attorney to fight harder than the minimal requirement, or maybe they assume the truth will inevitably rise to the surface. Jordan knew the truth does not always prevail without someone actively championing it. Glancing at his mother, Alicia Brown, who remained close by, Jordan recalled the many late-night conversations they'd shared. She used to describe how prosecutors occasionally took shortcuts, focusing on easy wins rather than genuine justice. Now, he had lived that experience personally, and had driven home just how vital it was to stay vigilant. The swarm of microphones might have disappeared for the time being, but in his mind, the larger question still loomed. How many of the defendants have been swept up in similarly faulty cases, overshadowed by prejudgments or sloppy detective work? The thousands of pages of legal code and procedure were meaningless if people misused them or skimmed over essential facts. For Jordan, the takeaway was unmistakable. The system's rules and laws are administered by human beings, and human beings come with biases, blind spots, and an occasional willingness to cut corners. Yet he believed that if enough individuals spoke up, whether lawyers, paralegals, or simply concerned citizens, the tide could shift. The well-worn path of quick convictions, superficial investigations, and silent acquiescence might gradually be replaced by real scrutiny and fairness. Jordan's ordeal, while harrowing, sparked in him a conviction that change was not only possible, but necessary. And as he prepared to leave the courthouse grounds, he silently vowed that his courtroom victory would be just the beginning of a much deeper mission for equity and integrity in the justice system. Throughout these courtroom accounts, a powerful lesson emerges. Knowledge can be the greatest equalizer when facing injustice. Even if our years of experience have brought us wisdom, we sometimes overlook how a calm and prepared individual, regardless of age, can unravel arguments that seem set in stone. For older adults, this insight is particularly relevant. Many have spent decades seeing how quick judgments or assumptions can harm lives, yet it's a quiet dedication to truth and fairness that can truly reshape outcomes. By actively seeking answers, refusing to accept excuses, and leaning on the lessons we've accumulated over a lifetime, we can challenge any imbalance of power we encounter. Whether at a small town council meeting, a dispute with a neighbor, or a misunderstanding at the local pharmacy, the principle remains the same. Speaking up with clarity and composure often reveals deeper truths. This approach also fosters respect. Younger folks might learn from our steady voice of reason, while we, in turn, remain open to the fresh perspectives they bring. In the end, each of us, at any age, plays a key role in keeping the scales of justice balanced, simply by refusing to let convenience or prejudice overshadow what's right.